Then God gave the people all these instructions. I am the Lord your God who rescued you from the land of Egypt, the place of your slavery. You must not have any other God but me. You must not make for yourself an idol of any kind or an image of anything in the heavens or on the earth or in the sea. You must not bow down to them or worship them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God who will not tolerate your affection for any other gods. I lay the sins of the parents upon their children. The entire family is affected, even children in the third and fourth generations of those who reject me. But I lavish unfailing love for 1,000 generations on those who love me and obey my commands.
Yeah, so as Nikki just said, this morning we're going to start a new preaching series which we've called The Cost of Giving. And obviously we are very mindful of the fact that we are, as a nation, dominated right now by spiraling costs. The war in Ukraine has obviously meant that energy prices have escalated dramatically. Interest rates rose again this week. Huge pressure on people's mortgages. Those of us who are in rental property have found that our costs of renting have increased. We've got inflation at 10% plus. We're still recovering from the economic effect of COVID. It's all pretty bleak, isn't it? Life has been very challenging financially and economically for many, many people. But I would actually suggest that there are even better reasons than those reasons that I've just given you why we need to focus our minds around the issue of finance and money this morning. There are really important discipleship reasons. We want to be a people who personally and individually are very intentional about pursuing Jesus and about following him. And as we'll see over the next few weeks, Jesus has a lot to say on the subject of money. More than that, we as a community want to be a community of radical disciples who live our lives differently from those people around us. We want to be that city on a hill. We want to be that light in the darkness that Jesus speaks about. Also, very conscious as we've talked as pastors and as leaders here at King's Community Church, we want to make sure that we don't simply talk about money and about finance just prior to a special offering. That makes preaching on finances built around our needs as a church rather than our commitment to make disciples. So it's actually really good to speak into the whole issue of money, not related to particular offerings or anything like that, but just because it's a huge discipleship issue. Jesus, as I say, has a lot to say about money. He has more to say about money than he does about heaven and hell combined. Jesus calls us to be a kingdom-minded people. That verse in the Sermon on the Mount where Jesus says, "Seek first my kingdom and my righteousness, and all these things will be added to you as well." It comes immediately off the back of 13 verses that are some of the most powerful verses in the whole Bible on the subject of wealth and material possessions. Jesus calls us to be salt and light in a corrupt and dark world. In other words, to live counter-culturally. And that includes attitudes to our bank balances, our debit cards, our credit cards, and all the rest of our material possessions. We're called as the people of God to be radically generous. I love the heart of people here at King's Community Church. I've mentioned it before, so forgive me if you've heard it before. But I love the fact that when COVID first hit 2.5 years ago, and long before the now Prime Minister came up with the furlough scheme, one of the first things that people said to me was, how can we be generous to those who are really going to struggle in COVID? Because some people were very conscious that the COVID crisis was not going to affect them at all. They were immediately thinking, how can we bless other people in the church and other people in the wider community and other people who are going to be massively hit around the nations of the world as well. And it was off the back of that that we set up the Help Fund, and we raised about £90,000 that we've given almost all of that away now. We're just holding a little tiny bit left. So over the next few weeks, we're going to dig into what Jesus says about money and possessions. But before we do that, we're going to focus on the elephant in the room. We're going to focus on the passage that we've just heard, because money is an idol in our culture. In fact, money is an idol in pretty much every human culture and civilization that I can think about. And the only way to deal with idols is to tear them down. And that's what we're going to do this morning. One of my favorite Bible stories is the story of Gideon. And if you know the story of Gideon, God calls Gideon to deal with the slavery and the oppression that God's people are living under, because they're being harassed and dominated by a tribe called the Midianites. And so God calls Gideon rather scarily, because Gideon is not a bold, confident sort of guy, but he calls him to lead his people against the Midianites. The first thing he says to Gideon is, you've got to deal with the idols in your own heart and your own life. And so Gideon, very sneakily at night time, because he's so fearful, goes and he tears down the family idol that is dominating his life at that time. So we're going to tear down some idols this morning, and we're going to build an altar to the Lord. Because basically, it's either Jesus or it's possessions. That's the heart of what I want to talk about this morning. It's a simple enough question, but we can place lots of caveats around it. But Jesus says very clearly, you either serve God or you serve mammon. And mammon is not a word that we're used to. Modern translations tend to translate the word mammon as meaning wealth or money. And that is what it means. But I kind of like the old-fashioned translation where it puts it mammon with a capital M. Because it's like Jesus is naming wealth almost as a person. The word mammon is actually an Aramaic word, and it means wealth, it means money, but it's like a spiritual force. It's not just a neutral object. I don't know who's ever seen Tom Hanks in Castaway? Anyone seen that film? Yeah, quite a few of you. Do you remember the truly tragic moment where he loses the only friend on the island that he has, Wilson the volleyball? Do you remember that moment? And what's interesting is the fact that he gives the ball a name and he then draws a face on it means that actually it's almost like the ball becomes a person. And so when the ball drifts out to sea and it's lost, it's almost like somebody's died. I remember seeing that with Janet and the kids, and I have to say, we all cried. Who cried at that bit? Is it? Oh, quite a few, yeah. You're with me on that one. It's a sad moment because Wilson has become a person. And that's a bit like what happens with money in our lives. And Jesus is very clear. He says, go, sell your possessions, give to the poor, you'll have treasure in heaven, and come follow me. In other words, Jesus is saying, what's number one in your life? Is it stuff or is it me? Is it Jesus or is it mammon? And the passage that we heard read just before I came to preach is one of the best known passages in all the Bible. It's the first bit of the 10 Commandments. We read the first 2 of the 10 Commandments. And when people hear the 10 Commandments, they often misunderstand what they're all about. They see the 10 Commandments purely as a list of rules. And we need to see the big picture of what God is saying through the 10 Commandments this morning. God gives his law to his people because of his saving grace. In other words, the call to radical obedience, the call to worship the one true God and have no other gods, comes out of what God has already done in our lives. In other words, Jesus first comes out of his saving power. So in the 10 Commandments, it comes very clearly, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. In other words, God is saying to his people and to us this morning, in the light of my saving power in your life, in the light of my grace, here's how I want you to live. I want to be number one in your life. So you see, the call out of idolatry, the call to worship God alone, is not simply a command. It's an enabling power of the grace of God at work in our lives that will utterly change our lives if we really get it. The problem is, it's much easier to take the boy out of Egypt than it is to take Egypt out of the boy. That's what Israel found, and it's true for us. Romans 1:25 tells us that as unbelievers, we were people who, before we came to know Jesus, we worshipped and served created things rather than the Creator. When we become followers of Jesus, on the other hand, the gospel of the grace of God changes us from the inside out, so that our appetites and preferences and values change. So we're able, by the grace of God, to say no to idolatry and to sin, because we're new people. We've got new desires. The grace of God teaches us to say no. And so my job as a pastor is to root out idols from our hearts. It says in 1 John chapter 5, dear children, keep yourself from idols. John, who wrote that, is the disciple described in John's gospel as the disciple who Jesus loved. He was very close to Jesus. He understood Jesus' heart. And he says, dear children, keep yourself from idols. And the process of rooting out idolatry in your heart starts with me rooting out idolatry in my own heart. It's painful, but it's so necessary and so desirable. It's like when the dentist works on your teeth. It's tough, but it's hugely beneficial. Because if decay sets in, it won't be pretty. Don't know whether we've got any dentists in the house this morning. I have to say, I hate going to the dentist. We were going through our diaries yesterday, and I suddenly realized he's coming up. Now, Janet, on the one hand, like we've been married 40 years, Janet has never had a filling in all of our married life. Incredible. Last time she had a filling was when she was 8 years old. Now, you're all applauding her. Good old Janet, she cleans her teeth. I clean my teeth too. I really look after them. But there's something of the genetics in my teeth means they have a predisposition to decay. And they fall out and fillings fall out. And I hate going to the dentist. It's a horrible experience, particularly because in Eastbourne, where we used to live, my dentist was a good personal friend, and every time we went to see him, he'd smile at Janet and say, "Well done," and he'd look at me with a very big frown on his face and sort of tut me. But you get the analogy. You have to endure the pain at the dentist. I grit the chair and, it's horrible. So I'm coming like a dentist this morning. There may be some pain involved, but the well-being benefits are enormous. I'm so glad, ultimately, for the dentist. Let's go back to the start, the Exodus story. Before God gives the Ten Commandments, they lived steeped in idolatry. It's all around them. When God sent the 10 plagues onto Egypt, it was his way of establishing that he was God above all the gods of Egypt. They're all false gods. And Israel comes out of slavery, and God gives her the wealth and the resources of Egypt. So we read in Exodus 12, the people of Israel did as Moses instructed, and they asked the Egyptians for clothing and articles of silver and of gold. And the Lord caused the Egyptians to look favorably on the Israelites. And they gave the Israelites whatever they asked for. So they stripped the Egyptians of their wealth. The NIV says they plundered the Egyptians. Can I say this morning, God wants to bless us like he blessed Israel, with significant resources, whether it's jobs or bonuses or commissions or inheritances or interest or rebates, through gifts that we never imagined would come our way. Just 48 hours ago, we were chatting to some friends that we know from a previous church. They had this amazing testimony. They were living very modestly in a rented house in a tough area of the town where they lived. And suddenly, completely out of the blue, somebody came along and said, "Will you come and work for me? I'll take over your business." And he gave them a huge bonus as a sort of sign-on fee as the company got sold, that enabled this couple who never ever had a chance of buying their own home to have a significant deposit towards their first home. That's the sort of thing God does, because he's a God of miracles and he's a God who supplies our needs. Now, we need to be clear, we're not preaching a health, wealth, prosperity gospel. That is a real problem in many parts of the world today. Started in America, but it's influenced so many parts of the world. And it basically says this: you put your tithe in, you pull the lever in some giant slot machine in the universe, and out comes health, wealth, and prosperity. That is not the gospel. It's a highly mechanical mindset that says, if I do X for God, he is honor bound and obligated to do Y for me. God's blessing is his generosity, not our entitlement. Do you get that? It's his generosity. It's not our entitlement. He may bless us, but it is not the object of our lives to accumulate wealth. The object of our lives is to love him and to put him first. And if we make wealth accumulation our priority, then we have created an idol. Now, God blesses us with wealth and resources, and his plan is that they be used for his kingdom purposes. Do you know why God gave Israel the wealth of Egypt? He gave them the gold and the silver as they came out of Egypt. It was because he wanted them to build the tabernacle. The tabernacle was a tent in which the Ark of the Covenant that contained the Ten Commandments was placed, and it was full of the glory and the presence of God himself. So the aim of God giving Israel wealth was for worship. But between Exodus chapter 12, where God gave them the wealth of Egypt, and Exodus chapter 35 to 40, where they actually build the tabernacle, you've got Exodus chapter 32. And Exodus chapter 32 is the story of the golden calf. Because what God had intended for worship became an idol. Gifts intended to prioritize worship had become idolatry. Impatience led to idolatry. The challenges of life, when Moses was up the mountain and Israel's left wondering what's happening in our lives, instead of trusting that God is in control, instead of knowing that he is a good God who would provide for all that they needed, they drifted towards idolatry. And Israel mimicked Egypt. Instead of being countercultural, they actually copied the very idolatry from which they'd just come. Because the God, the idol that they built, the golden calf, looked suspiciously like an Egyptian god. And they got into self-justification. If you read in Exodus 34, when they're asked, what on earth have you done? Aaron says this, well, we put the gold into a fire and out it came as this calf. Well, no, they fashioned it. They created it. It's as if to say it wasn't our fault we produced an idol. It sort of happened by accident. And that's like us who can excuse our materialism, our idolatry, by saying, well, that's just the culture of the world today. Did you notice something about the first half of the meeting this morning, different from any other Sunday meeting? What didn't we do this morning? We didn't take and give an offering this morning. We didn't bring our tithes and offerings before the Lord. I deliberately wanted to do that right now as a response to what we've been looking at. I want us to use this as an opportunity, like Gideon, to root out idolatry from our hearts so that we can build an altar to the Lord in worship. Do you notice how Gideon used the wood from the idols of his family as fuel for a sacrifice in worship? And we get to do the same this morning. We get to choose to tear down idols that dominate our culture, dominate people's thinking right now, and say, no, I choose to worship the Lord. I choose to acknowledge he is first place in my life. Let's stand, shall we? Can I say, if you are a guest this morning, maybe you're here for the very first time, thought, well, I love the worship, but I didn't really expect to talk on money. I'm not after your money. I'm really not. Please don't feel under any pressure. I want to point you to Jesus, because we live in a world full of idols, and he is the one true God. And it's all by his grace and his saving power. And what I'd love us to do this morning is I'd love us to take something on our person, if we've got it. I've got my mobile phone. Maybe you've got your wallet, or you've got your purse or your handbag, or you've got something on you that recognizes that you give financially. Don't know about you, I get paid on the first day of the month. And therefore, my regular giving, my tithe, 10% of my household income, goes out of my bank account on the first day of the month. And this is the first Sunday of the month. So it's a fantastic opportunity this morning to focus our regular giving. Probably very few of us will put cash or a check. Do you remember those things called checks that we used to write? Probably very few of us will put those things in the offering bowls this morning. But I've got my phone on me and I can turn to my banking app and I can look at what went out of my bank account earlier this week. I can see the standing order. And it's a sacrifice. We all get the opportunity this morning to bring our sacrifices before the Lord in worship. We honor God with our songs. We love sung worship. But this morning, we get the opportunity to honor God with our finances, with our bank balance, with our debit cards, with our cash. Wealth is not for idolatry, it's for true worship. Picture those two opportunities that Israel had in the story that we looked at this morning. She could build a tabernacle or she could make a cow. That's the choice before us this morning in our culture. It's no different in the 21st century. We can choose to worship God with our money, or we can choose to make an idol. And the one true God who gave us everything that we have stands before us this morning and says, which do you choose? I choose to worship him this morning. Let's respond, shall we?